This is not a podcast. This isn't a show. This isn't a trick, and this is not something to brush off. This is me recording clips of a very serious problem. We, the people of Earth, are in a state of emergency, and we must band together and protect our world from total devastation. For it's the only way that our world shall see a tomorrow, a next week. This is the emergency broadcast, and I thank you for listening. It should be noted that several things happened today, things that I never expected. Revelations that shocked me to my very center. I went to school with Karen, my best friend and fellow cautionist. At first, she wanted to talk about what I had been up to and seemed a bit disappointed when I told her that I had stayed up the previous night luring a level 2 emergency. She told me that I needed to find another hobby, and I told her that the forces of evil wait for no one's tennis classes to be over. She then told me that taking a jab at her will not work and that I should quit while I was ahead. And that is true. Karen Smith was someone with a heart of gold and intelligence that went further than many of the other bone dry intellectuals that flew through our halls, and a never ending source of optimism that I wish would dampen, if only because her whitened teeth blinded my eyes whenever she flashed that darling smile of hers. But I could never wish that for her. Ever. We walked in silence for a bit longer before pulling up to a Waffle House, in which we grabbed a seat and waited for our order to be taken. Karen ordered an orange juice and I ordered a black coffee. Once drinks had been sorted out, I could not help but notice that Karen had pulled out her notebook that she used for documenting things that she thought needed to be documented. It was an old, beat-up $7 notebook that looked like it had seen better days. I once asked Karen if she needed assistance updating the notebook so that it could be accessed on electronics, and she swatted away my ponderings to tell me that it would take away from the mystique of things. I didn't understand what she meant, and she told me that my life held so much mystique that this seemed bizarre to me. And I couldn't argue with that. But looking at the beat up notebook, I decided to ask if there was something new to be documented in her notes, and it seemed like that was the right thing to ask because she turned to me with a violet speed, and picking up her notes, she opened the book, leafed through a few pages before getting to a recently marked section, to which I was introduced to the name Rosie Allister. Karen immediately went into the basics. He moved to Redwood recently, rented out a small one-story house on Featherweather Drive. He was male, had red hair. He had been emancipated and gone into town and picked up groceries, a laptop, a $25 prepaid flip phone, a prescription for a fairly strong muscle relaxant, as well as hair dye. He was enrolled at our school and looked to be majoring in telecommunications. In the words of Karen, he was extremely handsome. At this, I decided to ask why she was gathering information on him. It wasn't like we hadn't had transfers and incoming freshmen before. What made this man different? At this, Karen gave me a smile and told me that this was going to be the kicker of the information she had gathered. Raising her hand, she pointed to a scribbled note and made me squint to read it before I sat back in shock. It looked like Rosie Allister was a cautionist, or at the very least a listener of the emergency broadcast for years, even back when my father was running the broadcast and not me, which made him very intriguing, because what was he doing here? Could it be a coincidence, or was there something else going on? Redwood was a small, little town, and the school out here was notorious for being a feeder schools for those looking for some sort of higher education out here in the middle of nowhere. And from Karen's notebook, it looked like he was from a slightly bigger town a few states from here, which made his appearance peculiar. Karen made me look up at the comment that he was in one of my classes, which made sense seeing that I was indeed in radio communications due to my devotion to this broadcast, and it looked like he was in telecommunications. But still, it felt weird. Almost pre-planned, though I had nothing to prove it. Karen then reinforced this by telling me with a mouthful of syrupy waffles that I was indeed being paranoid, and it wasn't a good look. I retorted that she shouldn't have said anything if she didn't want me to think this way, and she thought I would be excited to meet one of my listeners. To this, I said I was not. And I was not. Because something like this is unprecedented. Being a cautionist, meeting one of you is something I would never wish upon myself or any of you. The setup I have procured is based on anonymity. We do not know each other, but we do our part to spread the message and fight the evil that lurks out there. This is why we only know each other from forums in this broadcast, and I wish to keep it that way. But we continue. With this knowledge, we ate in silence as I thought about how to broach the topic of why this man was here. My bacon and eggs were delicious, which distracted me just enough that we made it to school without any trouble. Classes were classes. They steamrolled along and imprinted small bits of information in my brain that were boring but necessary. And I knew what I was getting into when I signed up for it, but my mind kept slipping back to Rosie Allister, a man who I had not seen once since stepping into the college, which sounds redundant until you realize that my student body is around 1,000 students, which is smaller than it sounds. Trust me. I was thinking that maybe I would see him, or at least I would know what he looked like by now. However, fortunate for me, he had a very distinct look that decidedly cut a few eyes when he walked through the door, which is to say that his hair was a shocking indigo blue. It didn't help that he had multiple piercings as well. It's not to say that there was something unusual about his way of dress. I am well aware that this style is popular on the internet, but it wasn't in the middle of nowhere America, so this aesthetic wasn't really seen much around here. Very rarely, actually. So to say he got stared at was a bit of an understatement. But unworried at the attention he was generating, he walked down the row of desks and sat down, right next to me, which made me think that what happened after this was something close to fate. The teacher hadn't shown up yet, which made sense, seeing as Harrison was known for getting caught up in whatever he does before class. He was always 15 to 20 minutes late when counting. Only a few students actually came at the allotted time the class was supposed to start, which might be why Rosie Allister was confused as he looked around at all the measly 5 of us typing on our phones and writing in our notebooks, which is when he said his first words to me, which so happened to be, "What the heck is going on here?" Maybe it felt a bit ironic, seeing as how that's how I felt looking at him here. His voice wasn't what I was expecting. It was deeper and rougher, like he gargled a bunch of leaves and cigarettes before walking into class. It didn't match his face at all. Maybe I was fixated on it a bit too long because he repeated the question, a bit more hesitant than the first time. I then explained what I just previously relayed to you, my dear cautionist. He seemed bewildered and confused. I very much felt the same way in his presence, so the feeling was mutual. He asked how long it would be, and I replied somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes. He then proceeded to grumble and huff that he could have gotten some food in that time. I agreed. He then looked at me again and asked if he knew me. That I seemed familiar, recognizable. And maybe if I was more subtle, more suave, and had better tact, I could have swung this in my favor, startled him, caught him off guard, and collected more information for Karen and you all. But I'm none of those things, and I've always been a firm believer of attack first, fix later. Just like here, so I promptly told him that he knew me from my voice, that you've listened to it on the radio. At this point, he stared at me. His eyes were weird. They were the color of chamomile, but they hit the light weirdly, the type of weirdness that made your eyes and head fuzzy. And thinking back on it now, I feel like if I stared long enough, I might have gone brain dead. But luckily, he snapped his fingers and jolted me back to reality. The look on his face, the instant recognition made a weird feeling rise in my stomach. Sure enough, a stream of chatter that followed was monotonous and expected. The "oh my goshes" and the "such a huge fans" and the "I never thought that he would look this tired, but that makes senses" were expected. But you want to know what he said that I simply didn't expect? Something that made everything silent and pushed this nagging feeling in my ear into full-blown shaken paranoia? He said, "You're wearing your hair exactly like your dad told me you'd be." Now at this, I paused. It was not a correct way to follow up after that tidbit of information. How do you react to a man telling you about your father when your father went missing 8 years ago? Well, I'll tell you how I reacted. Just a few simple words. "What the hell did you just say to me?" Rosie looked like he wanted to continue the conversation, but it was at this moment that Harrison decided to flounce into class looking as bewildered and disheveled as he always did. Except in this instance, it was more annoying than a familiar comfort. During class, I tried to get Rosie's attention, but to no avail. Another note to add to Karen's little notebook: he was a very studious person as well. I suppose in that aspect, he and Karen would get along. For some reason, that made me hope they never met. Class dragged on, but soon enough it was over. I turned to interrogate Rosie Allister. Peculiarly, however, he was gone before the first of the students even got to the door. His appearance stood out a bit too much for him to have just slipped by, which made his sudden disappearance even more strange and a bit disturbing. At the final scan of the room, I stuffed my things into my bag and tried to disappear like my now target had. I don't think I did it as successfully. I finally got a gap in my studies, and I think it might have been fate, because as I was walking to my car, I noticed something stalking out into the woods, or the thatch of trees that everyone pretends is enough on it not to see them copying fields of each other between classes. Cautionist. It would seem we have an emergency on our hands. In times like this, you should always go down the list to make sure that you are able to fight and secure an emergency. Please remember a flashlight, a knife, preferably coated in a poison, a weapon of choice, as we know I float between a gun and a bat, a containment device, a foldable cage, jar, heck, even a thermos will do in a jiffy. Backup, with that note I've already sent Karen a notice that there is an emergency on campus. And finally, an iron will. You'd be surprised how many people lack that one before trying to go into this business. Quite dreadful. Okay. As we can see, Cautionist, it has a Negus-like appearance, but has no claws or fangs from this angle. It looks like it's crouching, but even as it's doing that, it's small enough to only go up to my waist. It's clawing and digging and chewing up dirt. From this, I can tell it hasn't grown a taste for flesh. Oh, I stand corrected. It seems to have garnered a taste for worms, which now means that termination is on the table into the containment for further study. Usually for something this small I would make it quick and painless, but due to its proximity to my college, the noise of a gun will alert too many people of my location. It's not optimal. I know some pray for salvation, but this thing doesn't have a mind. And maybe it's better that way. The smell of an emergency never gets better. That's something that my father taught me, and something I'm inclined to agree with. The sickly sweet smell that they emit is strange at least, and sinister at most. And it sticks to you. Karen says I smell like a warning, which might explain why, other than her, I don't interact with many people at school. Though Karen would tell anyone that would listen that it gets better once you get used to the proximity. It should also be noted that Karen doesn't cry when cutting onions and lives with 3 brothers, so I feel that she's used to the smell of rot, though I don't think she's realized it herself. It would seem as though we were being watched. And we were. Emerging from the sparse shrubbery was the boy that had disappeared without a noise in class, just as I needed him to be the loudest. Rosie Allister. I still think he has a girly name. He stood there, assured, somewhat lazily, like he didn't even mean to find me out here. And maybe if it was any other person, I would have shrugged it off. I'm pretty sure that a good portion of my graduating class has seen me covered in mucus-like insights of emergencies anyway, and they usually never ask any questions. But like I said, this was different. So I asked him what he was doing here, and he replied that he always keeps an eye out for emergencies. He pulls his hair from over his ear and shows off an earbud that's supposedly broadcasting this broadcast directly into his ear. For some reason, I felt a bit of pride. At least someone other than me and Karen, and sometimes my mother, was taking the broadcast seriously, but that was to be reflected on another time. I asked him what he was doing here, how he found this town, and how does he know how I wear my hair. He says it doesn't matter right now, and maybe we can talk about it after our classes end. And I tell him I'm willing to skip classes to get this solved. He told me I don't seem like the type to skip. I'm not. He then said, and I quote, "Well, how about, to smooth this over, we go out and talk about it over lunch. Make a date out of it." I thought this was smart. We in a public place would be exchanging confidential information, but amongst people who had no idea what we were talking about. It sounded perfect, so I said, "Sure, let's make a date out of it." I mimicked his words. He looked amused. He told me he couldn't wait to see me there. And then he was gone. Just like he was in the classroom. I'm starting to think he's not just a fast guy who knows how to blend into a crowd. But then, he had lunch to explain that. Cautionist, this is where I leave you. For now, if only for this trip. What happens during lunch may change the course of our history. I hope you all stay to listen to it. Go forth, Cautionist. Hopefully you'll hear from me soon. Goodbye.